Hi, everyone. Welcome. And let me start by saying how wonderful it is to have Professor Dean Accardi as our seventh. Behzad and I are pleased to welcome Professor Dean Accardi of Connecticut College as the seventh speaker in our Persian Colloquium Studies series. And what better topic than early modern Kashmir? And Professor Accardi is a historian of gender, religion, and politics in South Asia and the Islamic world. He's interested in secularism, and this is from his faculty profile. So
my words,
his words. It's not my Tazkira entry on him. Anyway, and religious conflict, as well as the connections between religious and political practices, institutions, and discourses in early modern worlds. His research focuses on the gendered ascetic practices of saints revered by both Hindus and Muslims, and they're used to establish and articulate religious and political power. His research and teaching highlight how historical and religious narratives constantly reconstruct and deploy the past to serve particular socio-political agendas. His research and teaching also re-examine notions of mutually exclusive religions, hybridity, and syncretism, aiming to reconceptualize relationship between religions and other social and cultural phenomena, with particular attention to race, class, gender, sexuality, and ethnicity. His forthcoming book that he's currently working on is titled An Ascetic Body Politic, Sainthood and Sovereignty in Kashmir, which examines depictions of asceticism in histories and hagiographies written in late 16th century Kashmir and analyzes how the bodily practices of ascetic saints like Lal Ded and Nundarishi were used to shape ideas of gender, sainthood, and sovereignty. Maybe I should let you
that's more than
speak and for yourself now.
Okay. Thank you so much. No, and thank you. Thank you all for coming. First and foremost, it would be strange without nodding. I also want to thank Pradhan Keshavmurthy and I forgot to tonight for inviting me to speak here at the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill University as part of your prestigious Persianate Studies Colloquium. So as you see today, I'll be talking about the interactions between Kashmiri Sufis and non-Muslims in Kashmir, roughly in the 16th century. But as many of you likely already know, Kashmir has been renowned for centuries for its Persian writers, as you have published so extensively on. This is likely in part due to Persian being the official language of Kashmir's government from the 14th century to the end of the 19th century. But even then, the quality and quantity of Persian verse produced in Kashmir appears to outweigh the mere administrative necessity of it being a governmental language. It is even claimed, perhaps apocryphally, that the renowned Persian poet Hafiz began one of his poems with the black-eyed beauties of Kashmir and the Turks of Samarkand sing and dance on the strains of Hafiz of Shiraz's verse. However, those outside the Persian literary world could be forgiven for not knowing how renowned Kashmir is for its Persian writings, or how Persian is a deep and integral part of Kashmir's cultural heritage, past and present. For time and again, Kashmir is depicted, if not forcefully asserted, to be exclusively South Asian, Indic, belonging solely to the cultural and social worlds to its south. And all that is not so, all that is part of Kashmir and Kashmiri culture that is not Indic per se, is somehow considered foreign to Kashmir, temporary, ephemera that will fade away in time. It is as if Kashmir's Persianate world is a bird that became lost on its seasonal migration, tarried awkwardly in Indic Kashmir for a while, and then will in due time either return home or pass away. So whether it is Orientalists like George Grierson, who in his famous linguistic survey of India wrote, a more important division is that into the Kashmiri of the Muslimans, who are many and uneducated, and that of the Hindus, who are few and educated. Musalmani Kashmiri abounds in foreign words, borrowed from Persian, often in distorted forms. Hindu Kashmiri is very free from admixture with Persian, and although the home language of pundits is singularly free from Tatsamans. Most of the literature of Kashmir is written in Sanskrit and is deservedly famous, unquote. Or Historians like Shonalika Kaul, who in her 2018 Making of Early Kashmir asserts categorically on the basis of her reading of Kalhana's Rajasthanangini that Kashmir should be understood as Indic and Sanskritic, as above all else part of the quote Indic cultural zone and having a quote Sanskritic cultural identity. And then she says, Kashmir emerged on the discursive horizon of history with self-awareness as a land and a people in Sanskrit. Or politicians like current Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who in public speeches over the last 10 years has redefined Kashmirian, that notion that Kashmir has its own unique cultural identity, as being but a subset of Indian cultural identity. He says, quote, brothers and sisters, without Kashmirian, India is incomplete, not just Kashmir itself. It is because of this Kashmirian, which is the pride of India, that very tradition, that is our Kashmirian. From nearly every direction, people are actively erasing Kashmir's Persianate heritage to argue Kashmir is merely a subset and variation of India's Sanskritic Hindu culture, just a parrot of a different color, so to speak. But Kashmir is not a bird, not a cultural oeuvre, not a civilizational unit, not ideas or religious systems. Kashmir is people, Kashmiris, who live, breathe, and are themselves Kashmir. For what is Kashmir but where Kashmiris are? Despite the fact that so many act as if they would prefer a Kashmir without Kashmiris and treat Kashmiris accordingly, there is no Kashmir without Kashmiris. Now, I say this not merely because it's true, but also because it forms a cornerstone of what I want to talk about today. Much brilliant scholarship has been written about Kashmir, its history, its literature, and scholars like Chitralekha Zuchi in her Kashmir's Contested Past insightfully trace the continuities of Kashmiri history writing from what is often identified as pre-Islamic Kashmir through the Islamic period to the present. Now, I'm a great admirer of Zuchi's work, and in many ways, I would not be where I am today without her. But what I find interesting is that so many people who read such scholarship do so because they are intrigued or shocked by the idea that there could be continuities, connections, or reconciling between pre or non-Islamic or Hindu ideas, worlds, or worldviews, and that of Muslims, as if these are two mutually exclusive entities that cannot exist except antagonistically or mutually exclusively. Or one goes on at length to articulate such continuities or connections between them in terms of syncretism, as if they are oil and water and require an emulsifier to bring them together. But all of this theorizing and mental gymnastics are premised on the idea that we are trying to explain the interactions between cultural systems or civilizations or religions in some abstract sense, instead of recognizing the fact that cultures, literatures, religious systems only exist within people. And so, outside of the brief, very temporary encounters between visitors from a distant land interacting with those of a place new to them, there is very little of something distant and unfamiliar rubbing up against something wholly different. Rather, it is people within themselves thinking through new ideas, beliefs, practices, languages, and literatures, bringing them into conversation with things they already know, as well as their own experiences, and then discussing, interacting, and acting in the world alongside and in relation to other people they have lived side by side with and known their entire lives. Now, when I say this, it probably all seems quite obvious. You know, there are people and these things exist within people. But at least to me, it reframes the entire question when we realize that these continuities, conflicts, encounters are not between giant abstract things out there, but are within and among Kashmiris themselves, Kashmiris making sense of and navigating their lives in an ever-changing world. At that point, at least to me, it is no longer shocking that there may be continuities or shared values or practices between religious or social groups in Kashmir, Because of course there would be, because there have been and continue to be Kashmiris who have known and lived among each other their whole lives. What becomes interesting to me then is not the very fact that there are connections and overlaps between groups and religions, these ideas, practices, these languages and literatures, but rather how and in what ways Kashmiris work these things out in their minds, in their bodies, and in how they shaped their societies. Seen in this way, from the bottom up and with people as our focus, we see a much more textured and nuanced world in which Muslims and Hindus, Sufis and Shaivas co-created a world which includes and encapsulates one another. Or, as the title of my talk says, accounts of non-Muslims are confirmed, and Kashmiri Sufis acknowledge and embrace the legitimacy of local tradition. So, with that kind of introduction laid out, for those not familiar with Kashmir, or perhaps just to let me nerd out for a moment on history as a historian, let me provide a little background to the context of Kashmir and the period I will be discussing. So, as many of you know, almost every US president since Bill Clinton has referred to Kashmir as the, quote, most dangerous place in the world, or in the most dangerous place on earth. This should not be surprising, for they are more likely than not referring to the fact that what used to be the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir is now divided and separately administered by India, Pakistan, and China, three nuclear powers who have fought 4 official wars and countless military skirmishes over Kashmir. Add to this a thriving Kashmiri independence movement with a robust armed militancy and widespread popular support, and you have an intense situation, to say the least. Then add to the situation that the opened armed militancy was precipitated in no small part due to alleged mass electoral fraud in the 1987 Kashmiri elections, likely aided by the government of India, although that can't be fully confirmed. And that this upheaval coincided with violence towards and the mass fleeing of most of the Hindu Kashmiri Pandit community from Kashmir to India. And then a subsequent brutal Indian military crackdown on Kashmir. With all of that brought together, you have a situation in which multiple communities feel real pain, anger, and incredible loss on the basis of very real and ongoing trauma. But suffering in Kashmir is not new, and many Kashmiris look back with reverence to the time of the Kashmiri Sultanate, which lasted from 1320 to 1586. That period, serving as an anchor and revered source for their Kashmiri identity, heritage, and culture, was, for many of them, considered the last time the Kashmiris ruled themselves. It was during this time that the most prominent Sufi orders still central to Kashmiri life today, the Suhawardiya, the Kubrawiya, Rishya, and Nurbakshiya, were first established in Kashmir. And when many of the cultural practices and products for which Kashmir is renowned today, the Kashmiri cashmere, shawl, paper mache, engraved copper utensils, and samovars were said to have been first invented in Kashmir. Subsequently, Kashmiris were ruled over by the Mughal Empire from 1586 to 1753. After that, the Afghan Durrani Empire from 1753 to 1819, and then the Sikh Empire from 1819 to 1846, and then the Dogra princely states of Jammu and Kashmir from 1846 to 1947, and now by India, Pakistan, and China. Still others look further back than the time of the Kashmiri Sultanate, back to the time of the Utbala and Lohara dynasties, who ruled from 855 to 1003, and then 1003 to 1320, respectively, those two dynasties. And this is the time when the scholar Abhinavagupta articulated Trika Shaivism, and Kalhana wrote his famous Rajatarangani, chronicling the history of Kashmiri kings from its mythical beginnings to the 12th century. In any case, it is at the end of the 16th century that we witness the last of Kashmiri articulations of Kashmiri culture, identity, and religious ideas and practices, and understandings of all those things, before Kashmiris were ruled over by non-Kashmiris, meaning that we can catch a glimpse of how Kashmiris understood themselves with all the power and wealth of the state at their disposal before an external power asserted its hegemony and priorities over Kashmiri cultural and material production. So for my presentation today, I will be focusing on the writings of two Persian Kashmiri authors of that time period, Baba Daud Khaki and Baba Muhammad Ali Rana. Both were chief disciples of the renowned Suhrawardi Sufi saint, Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom Sahib. And I could go on about all these things for a very, very long time, but I will refrain as much as possible from giving you too many details regarding the political and religious institutions and complexities of the time period, or how I make sense of them and how they all come together. For that, you can read my book that hopefully should be coming out in a couple of years. However, of all of that historical context, you should know three things. First, in the late 16th century, there were two Kashmiri political factions competing for the throne. The first was constellated around an alliance between the Kubrawi, Suhrawardi, and Rishi Sufi orders, along with non-Muslim Kashmiris. And I just wanted to have this. This is, you can see the complex of relationship between religious institutions and political institutions. That up here we have a Mughal, then later Afghan fort at the top of the hill. And here is where Hamza Makhdoom Sahib's shrine is, on the same hill down the slope. As you can imagine, those who are interacting in the court are also interacting at the shrine. And so there's a deep relationship between the political and religious institutions. So as I was saying, so we have these, the Suhrawardi Sufis and the two authors, but that they are connected to the Kubrawis, the Rishis, and the non-Muslim Kashmiris in this kind of political alliance. The second political faction allied themselves almost exclusively with the Nurbakhshi Sufi order, which was a Shia-leaning offshoot of Sayyid Ali Hamadani's Kubrawi Sufi order, and which claimed to be the true heirs to the spiritual power and authority of Ali Hamadani, asserting the erstwhile Kubrawi Sufi order as either defunct, if not blasphemous, if they did not join the Nurbakhshi order. So there's a kind of threat to say, this is the legitimate one, join us, or you're our enemy. Okay, so sorry, I already dove into too many details about these opposed religious groups. All you need to know is that there are these two opposed religious groups, this cluster and the Nurbakhshi Sufis, but of course, it's not the religious groups themselves that are fighting, but political factions that connected themselves and constellated around these religious institutions. Now, second, you should know that the two authors that I'll be talking about today, Khaki and Rana, were Suhrawardi Sufi, and their Suhrawardi Sufi master, Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom, were close companions with Hardi Rishi, a Rishi Sufi saint who was part of the Rishi Sufi order. And so close were Hardi Rishi and Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom that both Khaki and Rana wrote extensive hagiographies of the saints of the Rishi order of Sufis within the context of their Suhrawardi Sufi hagiographies. So in many ways, it's kind of a joint venture in the anthologies writing about their saints. Third, you should know that the Kubrawi saint, Sayyid Ali Hamadani, was of such importance to Kashmiris at the same time, to all Kashmiris at the same time, that every religious organization, every Muslim religious organization, in one way or another, sought to claim him as their own and themselves as the true spiritual heir of Ali Hamadani. Okay, so with that background, I would like to turn our attention to certain key moments in Khaki and Rana's writings in which we can see how Kashmiri Sufis evaluated and incorporated narratives, practices, figures, and tropes of non-Muslim Kashmiris into Kashmiri Islamic traditions without falling into bid'at, heretical innovation, or syncretism. So let me start first. The first element I would like to discuss is this term Rishi. As many of you may have noticed, my mentioning earlier, the Rishi order of Sufis is one of the most important Sufi orders in Kashmir, both in the 16th century and in the present. This order was founded in Kashmir in the 14th century by the native Kashmiri Sheikh Nuruddin Nurani, more commonly known as Nund Rishi. And here is one, this is the only image I can find of him online anywhere or whatever. It's like everyone uses it. But this is his shrine in Shari Sharif. Excuse me. So, some have tried to claim that Nand Rishi's use of the term Rishi for himself and for his order is derived from an Arabic word or a Persian word, meaning like root or wound or all these sorts of things. But Daud Khaki, in his 1580 Persian hagiography, the Rishi Nama, unequivocally states that Rishi is a word from the language of Kashmir for a specific kind of disciplined ascetic, the Zahid, such that through the demonstration of their qualities, the working of God is made manifest. In other words, Nand Rishi adopted as the core term for his Sufi order, the title by which all saints of his order would be called, each of them, Hardi Rishi, all of them have Rishi as their title after their name, from a local term for ascetic holy men who manifest the divine through their actions. It is likely that we have all heard of the word Rishi before in this way, whether it be in reference to the ancient seers who spoke forth the Vedas, or maybe other holy men like the Beatles, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. But in any case, it is a term that has long preceded the arrival of Muslims in Kashmir in the late medieval period. In fact, collections of poetry attributed to Nand Rishi include poems of Nand Rishi praising perhaps legendary rishis of the past, like a Zulka Rishi and a Miran Rishi, accompanied by him expressing a desire that he, Nand Rishi, could be granted the same blessings and follow in their footsteps. In other words, Nand Rishi seems to consider some rishis of Kashmir's past preceding the coming of Muslims to Kashmir to be legitimate holy people, saints of true piety and nearness to God, whose ascetic practices and lives of devotion serve as a model Nand Rishi seeks to replicate with his order of Sufis. So how is this possible? Would this make the Rishi order of Sufis merely a Shaiva or Hindu ascetic tradition wrapped in a superficial Islamic clothing? Some early Orientalist scholars certainly thought so. You can look them up. However, upon a more thorough examination, the religious content of Nand Rishi's teachings appear soundly anchored in Islam. And all the early sources about Nand Rishi from the 16th and 17th centuries attest to the same, either directly in the writing itself or by it being attested to by respected Sufis in the narratives that they write. So to reconcile this sense of apparent inconsistency, we need to take a side path for a moment. So bear with me. In Daud Khaki's Qasida Lamia, both Nand Rishi and later Hardi Rishi are said to have performed miracles. In Khaki's own commentary on this section of the Qasida Lamia, which he writes in the Rishi Nama, you don't need to know the complex, but the Rishi Nama is a kind of auto commentary on his more succinct Qasida Lamia. Khaki explains how miracles work through extensive citations and religious authority. It goes on for pages and pages. But in short, while everyday people think that saints perform miracles themselves out of some special power they possess, wise people know that in fact, those miracles are performed by God on behalf of those saints. So the question is, why would God do that? To explain, Khaki shifts the term he uses for miracles from karamat, which more technically means kind of generosities or kindnesses, to tarkeadat. More technically translated, most often technically translated as kind of contrary to nature or a kind of break of natural law. Tarkeadat does indeed indicate a suspension of the natural order of things. But Khaki goes on to explain that more literally, tarkeadat means breaking one's habits or breaking the usual action. For Khaki expresses that all natural laws are in fact God's habits, how God typically does things in the world. It is then that Khaki makes a bold assertion. You see, Khaki is aware that in many Sufi circles, asceticism is considered a low-level preliminary stage on the mystical path, after which one begins the real work of cultivating desire, ecstasy, unity, remembering and dwelling in the divine, and so forth. In fact, some renowned Sufi thinkers have asserted that asceticism after these initial stages can instead be a distraction, as it focuses upon the body instead of the spirit, and may involve egoism in trying to show others how extreme one's bodily deprivation is, and thus assert one's superiority over others, all of which is contrary to the breaking down of one's nafs or carnal desires, as well as contrary to the cultivation of selflessness in the presence of and in the remembering of God, which is what the Sufi path theoretically should be. In contrast, though, in contrast, Kaki asserts that asceticism may serve as a key feature throughout the Sufi path, and in fact, may be integral to how sainthood functions. Citing well-known ascetic prophets like Yahya or John the Baptist, and a multitude of ascetic Sufi saints, Kaki argues that the defining feature of what makes a saint, makes a wali, is nearness or closeness to God. While some of those who have achieved such closeness to God may live their saintly lives without anyone coming to know of their elevated status, a definitive sign of closeness to God is the production of a genuine miracle. But as we know, miracles are really just God suspending a habit on behalf of one close to them. Why does God suspend a habit on behalf of one close to them? Because a saint has suspended their own habits for God's sake. Actually, even more touchingly, Kaki explains that when one engages in immense, difficult asceticism, depriving oneself of one's desires for God's sake so completely that even one's own carnal soul, one's nafs, abandons one, leaving one completely and utterly alone. Then, with great pity, God comes to be their sole companion, drawing near to them. And in return for breaking one's habits and desires for the sake of God, God in return breaks their habit for the sake of the saint. Thus, asceticism itself, when performed properly and with the right intention, not only leads to nearness to God, i.e. sainthood, it also generates the proof of one's sainthood, namely God abandoning a habit for the sake of the saint, i.e. miracles. So touching while this may be, how does this relate us back to the term rishi? Well, according to this logic, if someone is known to have engaged in strict asceticism in the correct manner and produced a general miracle as a result, it must mean that the person has achieved closeness to God or sainthood. All records of the rishis of legend attest to the fact that they did just that. Therefore, logically, those Sufis of old must have been great pious saints, following the true path and will of God, even though, like the prophet Yahya, they lived before the time of the prophet Muhammad. Thus, while socially, historically, we can say that Islam began in the 7th century with the prophet Muhammad, for believing Muslims, if Islam means submitting to the will of God and following the righteous path, and the fact that God has set forth their will since the beginning of time, and the Quran, which sets forth the righteous path, also existed from the beginning, but was only finally made manifest through the words of the prophet's recitation, then Islam has existed since the beginning of time. And rare, great people were able to live as good, righteous, pious Muslims and achieve saintly nearness to God, even before the prophet came in this world. With this perspective, then, Nund Rishi's decision to name his Sufi order after ancient ascetic rishis finally makes sense, as they serve as a model of the ascetic path to God. The ascetic bodily practices attributed to them that Nund Rishi claims to adopt for his Sufi order are truly Islamic through and through from this perspective. An incredible repercussion of this is how it recalibrates not only how we understand what figures like Nund Rishi were doing, it also prompts us to reconsider how we approach such religious phenomena in the past, and how our priorities and intellectual frameworks may differ greatly from theirs, resulting in misunderstandings. First, as I already mentioned, it prompts us to question the kinds of religious temporalities we apply to those in the past, such as that Islam only starts in the 7th century, so any religious claims made by Muslims about things that existed before the 7th century should be dismissed or taken with a grain of salt. Such attitudes can grant a kind of privilege and greater authority to those religious groups claiming to have existed further into the past, like somehow they have precedence, Second, it appears that our prioritization of theological and cosmological matters when it comes to religion may be mismatched with that of scholars of the past like Reina and Kaki, for whom what we can and cannot know may necessitate different priorities. For example, being well-educated, Reina and Kaki were likely well aware of the fact that non-Muslims had other explanations for how and why the rishis of old were able to produce miracles, whether it came from tapas or the power or grace of particular gods or goddesses. However, Kaki argues that those miracles come from the nearness to God, resulting from living a pious life on the righteous path of God's will. While he likely preferred and believed his own explanation, ultimately, one can't know definitively the true source of those miracles. So that should not be our overriding focus. Instead, what we can know and agree to is that people like the rishis of old, Nund Rishi, and other saints with the miracles to prove it, that they are truly saints, and that the ascetic practices they hold in common must be agreeable to whoever or whatever the source of their miracles is. And thus, replicating those practices must be an expedient means to sainthood that should be taught and cultivated. Focusing on what is definitively known and effective should be prioritized over that which is debatable and can cause contention. And it is just this kind of practicality, albeit couched in an immense amount of citations of scholars and examples from authoritative figures of the past, that I see functioning in the writings of these early modern Kashmiris like Reina and Kaki. Okay, now the second element I would like to discuss follows from the logic of the first example, but I will be focusing namely on one figure, the figure of Lal Ded. Lal Ded is one of the most well-known saints of Kashmir, wandering across the Kashmiri countryside as a naked ascetic back in the 14th century. Furthermore, Lal Ded is almost always connected in one way or another with Nund Rishi, the aforementioned founder of the Rishi Sufi order. And Nund Rishi is even said to have so revered Lal Ded that he considered himself Lal Ded's spiritual successor. Now today, Lal Ded is most often celebrated as a great Hindu saint of 14th century Kashmir whose poetry expresses a bhakti devotionalism towards Shiva. Devotional poems attributed to Lal Ded, called Vox, continue to be an important part of Kashmiri culture, often recited at gatherings and festivals. And so famous has Lal Ded become that one of Srinagar's premier maternity hospitals is named the Lal Ded Maternity Hospital. However, in the historical record, Persian writings about Lal Ded seem to precede any appearance of poetry attributed to Lal Ded by at least 50 to 100 years. In fact, the earliest written mention of Lal Ded appears in Muhammad Ali Reina's 1587 Tazkirat al-Arifin, an anthology of the saints of Kashmir that includes prominent saints of the Rishi Sufi order. Since Lal Ded is considered a saint and is intimately connected with the legacy of Nund Rishi, accounts of Lal Ded are also included in Reina's anthology. And Reina begins his accounts of Lal Ded as follows. The exemplar of the Gnostics, the best of lovers, an enraptured one, Majub, among the partisans of the reality of God, the honorable second Rabia, Bibi Lalamoj, and the mercy of God be upon her. Although she had the form of a woman, she in fact surpassed noteworthy men. One day, while traveling naked and passing Hazrat Nuruddin, i.e. Nund Rishi, may his grave be hallowed, he stood to honor and serve her. Now, I don't have time today to discuss all the accounts of Lal Ded in Reina's Tazkirat al-Arifin, but I will tell you that it includes a story of her taming a lion, turning him into a majzub, and an affirmation that she indeed was a naked ascetic, but her nakedness was nonetheless not visible to ordinary men, like the stars hidden by daylight. What is most significant for us today is that most of these accounts narrate encounters between Lal Ded and prominent Sufi saints, especially those of Reina's own Suhrawardi order, including the renowned Jalaluddin Makhdum Jahaniya Jahangasht al-Bukhari, who passed beyond the veil in 1383. When Lal Ded and Makhdum Jahaniya meet in these accounts, they greet each other and express mutual respect. However, when they ascend the higher celestial planes through the heavens together and stand before the throne of God, Makhdum Jahaniya recognizes that Lal Ded is more spiritually advanced than himself. So upon returning back to earth, he asks for her blessing. And in return, he teaches her his spiritual methods and grants her his ijazat, or spiritual license, to pass on the teachings of the order, but with her spiritual authority to future Suhawardi Sufis. Then, in a later account, long after Lalda is said to have passed away, she appears before Reina himself, despite his being in a nearly inaccessible solitary retreat in the mountains. Now, it must be said that Muhammad Ali Reina was not just a disciple of Sheikh Hamza Makdum Saab, he was also his brother. Now, when in this account Lalda addresses Reina, she does so as my brother, Muhammad Ali, to which he replies with shock and confusion, as he has no sister and his brother did not marry. Taking pity on him, Lalda explains that she, in fact, knows Reina well from the spiritual world, and that she was his brother's esoteric Sufi master, teaching him from beyond the grave. And that because of that lineage, he is a brother of hers, sharing in disciplic lineage, being equal to, if not greater in significance than blood relations. Duly humbled and chastened, Reina honors and submits to Lalda, who then teaches him esoteric mystical visualization, meditation, and recitation practices, which after he performs them over an extended period of time, brings about in Reina spiritual states greater than he had ever experienced before. Finally, Reina describes Lalda as one who, despite having lived her whole life in Kashmir, has knowledge of all spiritual masters of the past, present, and future, as well as their relative spiritual status. And says of her that although having the form of a woman, surpassed noteworthy men and had no equal in her time among the great men of the Sufi path. What is significant for us in these accounts is that Lalda is proven a saint via her miracles, ascending to the heavens, being worthy enough to God to be near and in the presence before God and the throne, her having special esoteric knowledge of the relative spiritual status of past, present, and future saints, her passing on elite esoteric Sufi practices from the beyond the grave, and so on. She has proven her sainthood over and over and over again. Yet, she is explicitly stated to have never left the land of Kashmir. She is proved to be superior to all saints that she encounters, and that superiority precedes meeting any of them. And she is never said to have converted to Islam. How is this possible? Well, we can see in Reina's accounts of Lalda an extension and intensification of the same logic discussed earlier with regard to the term Rishi. For Reina and his fellow Suhawardis, revering Lalda is not bidat, or heretical innovation, for she is such a pious follower of the righteous path through which she has achieved nearness to God to such a degree that God produces miracles on her behalf, that in other words, she was not outside Islam and then incorporated into it, as Bidat accuses. Instead, she is an exemplar of Islam in piety and saintliness itself, even without formal conversion to Islam. To claim revering Lalda is Bidat would be like claiming Muslims should not revere Isa, Jesus, or Musa, Moses, because they lived before the Prophet Muhammad and never formally converted to Islam. Furthermore, in a similar vein, I would be hesitant to consider this reverence for Lalda to be syncretic. Most often when we claim something is syncretic, it means religious ideas, beliefs, practices, etc., from one tradition are merged into another, generating an entirely new entity, unique and separate from what came before it. But in this instance, a figure, Lalda, is understood, framed, and revered within the logic and worldview of the original tradition. Although I cannot definitively prove it, I would suspect Reina, at least to some degree, understood the beliefs, understandings, gods and goddesses of local Kashmiri non-Muslim traditions, whether you would like to call them Trika or Shaiva or Hindu or Sanatana or something else. I'll leave that up to you. Yet Reina does not seem to merge them into his understanding of Islam. Rather, he seems to acknowledge that non-Muslim Kashmiris may have a different explanation for Lalda's saintliness, which he doesn't try to prove wrong. And instead of fixating on theological matters, he seems more focused on the shared common ground, that Lalda is a saint we can all attest to, and moreover, that she is an ascetic saint, her asceticism deeply integral to her saintliness. To put it succinctly, finding, evaluating, and acknowledging the value of a figure within one's own religious understanding does not syncretism make. And to this last point, I turn to my final element, which I'll analyze in this presentation, namely nature spirits said to inhabit the various springs and rivers of Kashmir. In the Rishinama, Daud Kaki explains, put it up there. In the histories and stories of the wise monks or hermits and astrologers, the Rahaban wa Munajaman of Kashmir, in the words and script of Kashmir, God knows, it is delineated. Most springs that are located in the mountainous areas of Kashmir appear like water and nothing else in the eyes of those who only see the surface of things. But in the view of various people of mystical vision and discernment, they are one among the hidden worlds created by the Lord, the Exalted, whose visible marker is this water. Each of the main springs has a particular name and is endowed with unique and miraculous qualities. And God grants some of them such power that externally they remain flowing as predestined as rivers. But esoterically, having made a facsimile, tamsil, they travel places. Sometimes they take the form of a man, and sometimes they have the form of a mother, sons, or daughters endowed with beauty. If a pious one with their water performs purifications and accomplishes divine worship of God, the Exalted, they become pleased with him, say a prayer of kindness for him, and give witness to his devotion in the final days. From the presence of wicked ones and speakers of bad words and non-believers, they become dejected and vexed, and sometimes they inflict injury and misfortune on various amongst these wicked people. They have much desire for the presence of the people of piety, and they themselves also, to the power of their ability, worship God, the Exalted. They have distinctions in manners and ranks, and for pilgrims with their purification, and those who perform ablutions, and those who wash, some can deliver, on the whole, a kind of grace according to the power of their rank and their purifying capabilities. Unquote. So from the very start, Kaki provides something remarkable here. First, he acknowledged and validates the histories and stories of Kashmiri scholars written in the words and script of Kashmir. Later in the Rishinama, Kaki directly states that he is in fact validating the lore on these matters written by earlier non-Muslim sages. In fact, it is from this passage, which I'll share with you in a moment, that I pulled the title of today's talk. Thereby, accounts of non-Muslims are confirmed. So while this next one, I apologize again, is a bit long, I will quickly read my translation of this significant passage as I think it carries some important weight. In the Compendium of Virtues, Khulasat al-Manaqib, Badakhshi's hagiography of Ali Hamadani, that prime saint of Kashmir, in the descriptions of the stations and the rules of esoteric mystical terms, I have read, quote, when the hidden mind or intellect obtains purity, the spirits of minerals, plants, and animals, the forms of the jinn, the mystical states of some of the dead and the living, and some of the qualities of the carnal soul, the nafs, become visible, unquote. Let it not remain hidden that some of those who only see the external, the zahir, out of malice and jealousy, refuse to accept this speech, this important point made by Ali Hamadani. And with flimsy doubts or weak excuses, they intend to deny the existence of this world that can only be known by those who are endowed with mystical vision, and the mysteries of the heart. Indeed, to shame those jurists, those faqih, in regard to the mysteries of the heart, calling them those who remain enemies out of ignorance, he replied to them, quote, on the world of water, there is exoteric and esoteric knowledge. While the external of it is apparent, the esoteric, the interior, which is the angelic part of this world, is hidden from the world. And the hidden world of the true, the exalted, cannot be summed up to a number. And most of the veiled ones, the mahjuban, those who don't have mystical vision, are not able to become aware of that world. It is a world capable of existing, and the honorable Lord of the worlds has given the power to give it existence. Thus, when a believer of mystical vision who has sincere speech and sincere mystical vision becomes experienced in the other world and gives news of that world, this speaking is not adversarial nor contrary to the book, the Quran, and the tradition, Sunnah. Unquote. Thus, it is confirmed that speaking on that which is not inherently perceived is accepted, and the famous reports of non-Muslim storytellers, soothsayers, astrologers have been corroborated. Indeed, when they see the sayings of some soothsayers as useful for their own prayers, even Islamic clerics, the ulama, recall and mention those sayings in the midst of a miracle to confirm their point. For example, it is mentioned in the Qasida Barda, after the substantiation of the report of the soothsayer, their faith is shown to not be corrupt, unquote. In the Ascent of Prophethood are reported items from this category, meaning the reports of non-Muslim soothsayers that confirm real miracles, unquote. Thus, we see once again, got to move it to there. Okay, so thus we see once again that Kaki is providing a well-substantiated argument for the acceptance of non-Muslim knowledge of spiritual matters. However, it is not blind acceptance or absorption of those traditions. Rather, that knowledge must be confirmed by saints with mystical visions and their miracles, which substantiate God's nearness and thus approval and thus veracity of that knowledge from non-Muslim sources. In addition to affirming the reliability of non-Muslim accounts, Kaki's description of the spirits of the springs of the waters of Kashmir depicts an entire hidden world of pious beings who worship God the way God intended them to, who have their own societies, clans, hierarchies, etc., and who are interested in becoming better people, improving themselves spiritually, and thus may seek discipleship and spiritual instruction from Sufi saints who have the miraculous ability to see them and communicate with them. Such a statement is very similar to how the Prophet Muhammad is said to have preached and converted jinn, and how one of the epithets of Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani is Qawse Saqlain, meaning defender of both men and jinn. However, importantly, Kaki insists that these nature spirits are neither angel, nor jinn, nor demons, shaitan. Instead, they are beings of a different kind. And he cites eminent scholars like Ali Hamadani to prove there exists other beings that are part of God's broader creation. Thus, I have no doubt that while I have no doubt that Kaki believes this to be true, such an assertion also serves other ends. First, doing so avoids entangling these beings into pre-existing mythos of angels, jinn, and demons, which could complicate and possibly over-determine how one identifies and interacts with these beings. But second, and more importantly, angels, jinn, and demons, by and large, are free-moving, by which I mean they are not bound to one location, and theoretically could travel wherever they wish, or wherever God wills them to go. In contrast, these water spirits are tied to a specific location. While they have their God-given ability to take on human form, visibly or invisibly, they can move about to a certain degree. Part of them is always still tied to that natural formation, that river or spring. This means that it is perfectly reasonable to travel to such a site, like a mountain spring, to pay homage to that being, as no matter what they are tied to, they are tied to that place, and thus receive your homage, even if another part of them is traveling about in a facsimile form. In turn, this then validates and justifies non-Muslim religious practices at those sites, recoding such practices as expressing honor, respect, or reverence to those beings, rather than worship per se. It is particularly handy that often such religious practices appear identical to, or at least similar to, how one would pay respects to an important visitor or a respected elder. Furthermore, kind of thinking about these spirits and talking about them in this way provides a reason for why a saint would set up their hermitage in a location where non-Muslims believe a spiritual being lives, whether non-Muslims identify that being as a yaksha or a goddess. It is that saint would then have a pious companion in their remote location to aid in their pure spiritual pursuits, or possibly the saint could even teach them as a disciple. Once a close bond is made between a Sufi saint and such spiritual beings, one could then call upon that saint to obtain their friend's help to bend the natural world under its control to what is needed. In The Millennial Sovereign, Azfar Moin argues that in early modern South Asia, controlling the spiritual resources of one's realm is just as important as one's military and technological resources. Being able to produce a cover of fog or flood a battlefield can change the tide of war in one's favor. One could perhaps obtain such miracles from a saint appealing to God directly, but getting a saint to ask their spirit friend and companion and possible disciple to make such things happen for them is much easier. But I digress. What is important here is that Kaki is not merely affirming the stories and knowledge of spiritual matters, but is in fact affirming the existence of such spiritual beings themselves, that they are embedded in the landscape of Kashmir, that interacting with them and even revering them is perfectly acceptable and wholly consistent with the practice of Islam. Bringing them into one's spiritual life and practices as a Kashmiri Muslim is not bid'ah, as there is extensive precedence in the life of the Prophet and eminent Sufi saints to corroborate this practice. Furthermore, it is not syncretism, as again, there is no merging of religious systems into something unique and separate from what came before. Rather, it is a way Kashmiris are to live Islam locally and in and of Kashmir itself, as Islam is universal, but amenable and applicable in unique ways to every time and place. All right, so there we have it. 3 moments in the Persian writings of 16th century Kashmiri Sufis in which they evaluated non-Muslim narratives, practices, and figures and incorporated what they deemed legitimate into Kashmiri Islamic traditions. I hope to have convincingly argued and demonstrated how doing so neither engages in bid'at or syncretism, and that a more nuanced understanding of how early modern Kashmiris perceived, negotiated, and interacted with the past, the natural world, religious identities, and bodily practices, and religious authority were all configured quite differently and along different lines than how we tend to understand and study religion today. But most of all, I hope to have impressed upon you all the importance of keeping human beings at the center of one's studies, to remember that ideas and cultures and religions do not exist out there, but in here, in people, and to always keep Kashmiris, the living, breathing people of Kashmir, who are themselves Kashmir, at the center of any and all conversations about Kashmir. Thank you.
Questions?
I could sit down. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for such a good presentation. That is what I would expect of you, and now that I have the same hairstyle as you, I know that it comes with the removal of hair. So, I have a million questions and comments, so we can talk about some of them later, but maybe I will just make one quick comment, a question, and a comment. So first of all, with regard to the last part of your presentation on water, and of course, I know the kind of thing you're talking about, the Safinatul Awliya or Khazinatul Awliya, this lithograph that's in the Gilbert books. I think I sent you a copy. Contains the story of Laudid having a pot broken on her head, and water remained standing in spite of the pot breaking. But I just wanted to mention that James Perrin, if you are in touch with him, is working on something interestingly similar to what you're talking about, but in the context of more modern Pashto language thinking. So be in touch with James. With regard to your emphasis on the local, I think we've talked before about Maktoum Jahanian, right? And he's a wonderful buddy. He talks to cats. He encounters dragons, but the cat thing is most important for both of us, I think.
And for the world.
And for the world, certainly, they're very important, they're very important beings, mainly Jinn most of the time. But so in the case of, you focused on very sort of localized figures. But when we look at the story of Makhdoom Jahanian, it's very different because, of course, he's going all over the place. So is it, I don't know whether you've thought about this figure, but how would you bring him into the conversation, given the kind of, the traveling that's implicit in his very name? And finally, and we can talk more about this later on, I thought that there are many great things about your talk. First of all, the attention to the critique of syncretism is very important, and very few people do that well, I think, and you've done it very well.
Thank you.
But this discourse on Adat is very interesting. And this idea of the Tariqul Adat, what I would translate as custom breaking, I don't think of it in terms of nature, in terms of the idea. This is, I think, something that Islamic moderates like to say it back onto the idea of Adat. But at the same time, I hadn't heard it. Of course, Adat in modern Urdu, for example, is a habit, something that you do regularly. And in Arabic, it has the sense of going back to something that happens again and again. And therefore, Ibn Arabi, in his discussion of the Adat, talks about, and he has this famous line, "La taqra fil tajalliyat." There is no repetition in the self-manifestations of the divine, and therefore, from a certain perspective, there is no, right? There's no, nothing is actually going back to what it was, because there's no, one never steps into the same river twice. Right? But what's really interesting to me in what you presented is the idea of this interpretation of Adat as, for example, anthropoid habit, right, which I haven't seen before. That God breaks God's habits in a kind of reciprocity to the human. So I'd love to hear more about that, because again, I've read a lot about Adat. I've never heard that before. I'm going to end it there, and we can talk more.
Sure. Thank you, Pasha. I would love to hear more. We could talk later about what exactly James Cairns up to, because that's intriguing for me. But yeah, to your two questions. So first, Makhdoom Jahanian. Yeah, so in this presentation, I have focused a lot on the local and the connections between Kashmir's past and the Kashmir's further past from this moment in the 16th century. But there is a lot of conversations and figures from the kind of broader world of, the Islamic lore, Sufi histories, so on and so forth, that are throughout these texts. And I haven't been able to talk about it much today, but there's a way in which I think that the Hamza Makhdoom Sahib is a major saint in Kashmir, and yet his literal physical disciplic lineage is kind of weak. That it was just the kind of low-end Suhrawardi passing through Kashmir for a moment is the one that initiated him. And so I get a sense that there is maybe some anxiety around that, or a desire to strengthen the pedigree of the order in some way. And so knowing the fame that Makhdoom Jahanian is gone everywhere, and is such an important and revered Suhrawardi saint, that I think there was a desire to connect Hamza Makhdoom directly to a powerful Suhrawardi like Makhdoom Jahanian. But of course, they didn't live at the same time. So how do you do that when, how could it be? And that Lalda, in an interesting way, kind of functions as a conduit at that moment. I often say that, like, such celebrations of women figures seem really great, but if there's a way you can interpret this to be the worst patriarchal version of things, that's probably the right way to be interpreting it in the circumstance. In this way, it's like, oh, Lalda, this great figure, someone who is, being held up in a great way. And it's like, I think she's serving as a means to an end for in this circumstance, that it's like she becomes that through which the kind of spiritual power, the barakat or whatever, the lineage can be strengthened for Sheikh Hamza Maktoum. Likewise, that when they say that she is able to kind of know the relative spiritual status of every Sufi saint, past, present, and future, it's interesting because when they say that, then they say, oh, and she also said that Sheikh Hamza Maktoum was like awesome. And so it's like, oh, she knows all of them and picks out him as particularly standing out. But another reason that can happen is because she's out of the competition, that somehow because she's a woman, she's not in, she can't be ranked among them. She's like outside, but can function as an outside arbiter for ranking men. In that way. And so in a kind of, and there's other instances in which, like Nundrishi is said to have been like reflecting on or kind of visualizing Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, and she can see what's in his head. And as I said, she wanders about naked. In that moment is the only moment in which she covers herself. And she says, oh, it's because I've finally been brought into the presence of like a real man, right? So there's this, reinforcing of a certain kind of masculinity there, but in the mind of this other one. And even Nundrishi is like, why are you covering yourself up? You never cover yourself up in front of me. And she's like, well, it's not you, it's what's in your mind, you idiot. Like, so there's this way in which she becomes a way of speaking to authoritatively about men and masculinity, especially in an ascetic environment in which bodily asceticism carries a lot of masculinity and competitive masculinity with it. So I think that's a bit of how Maktoum Jahaniya is woven into this narrative. The Adat, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but yeah, I wish I could claim that thinking about it as a human habit was my own idea, but it was cocky. I mean, he wrote like very, bluntly saying like, this is, and like I said, with this whole kind of knowing, again, this kind of shoring up one's tradition versus kind of presumed opposition, that he's trying to say, no, asceticism is good, and asceticism throughout is good. And this kind of fits into my larger project of the book, is to talk about like, why is it that asceticism took on such value in Kashmir during this time? And I think it does have a value in not only in organizing these Sufi institutions, but became connected to masculinity and power and authority of the state and the political factions that formed around them. So, so this kind of assertion that bodily asceticism is tied to, is not just like, oh, it's a nice way to get to sainthood, but like is possibly even requisite for sainthood, is a kind of overturning of a lot of tradition, or at the very least is a defense of that this logic works and therefore can be used religiously and politically.
Right. That's going to need to read the book.
Right.
Isn't that also the case, in a way, already the case with all the Futuwa orders in Khorasan, medieval Khorasan, even before Islam comes to Kashmir, you have all these Jawan Nadi orders in Khorasan where asceticism is a form of civic bonding, and therefore politically important. So how exceptional is this? In fact, even your larger argument that these writers, rather than being syncretic or indulging in bid'ah, appropriate ambient traditions, ambient non-Islamic pre-Islamic traditions, under the sign of Islam. Right? That's how they see it. Isn't this in a way a Kashmiri equivalent to what Karl Ernst talks about in his Sufism and Yoga essay, right? Where you have the Amrit Kund being Persianized and Arabized as the Haus al-Hayat. right? Or you have the counterpart of that. You have the Nath yogis claiming that Islam is as popular as it is because Muhammad was a Nath yogi, right? No one thinks of themselves as syncretic. They think of themselves as pure, and as appropriating the other. So there's a kind of competitive spirituality. So in that sense, is the structure of the argument new, or is it a filling in of the Kashmiri gap?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So on the one hand, I would say that I want to speak to what I know best.
Right.
And I know intimately these sources and what's going on in Kashmir at this time. So other people say like, oh, is this unique to Kashmir or is this something broader? And I would say, I suspect it's broader in all sorts of spaces, but we also know that there's competing logics of authority butting up against this. I mean, Khaki even, you can see in those commentaries like some ulama out there are idiots, like that there's this sense of things. So, but I do find it interesting that I guess in some ways to say like they are, this kind of asceticism is also tied to these spirits in the landscape, tied to the land and tied in all these sorts of ways. At that point, it's like, it makes it very local, and yet maybe every locality is doing this. Like us from Muin is talking about these people that are using the spiritual resources around Delhi and whatnot. So the kind of larger phenomenon, I actually think it's not totally unique to Kashmir. I think it's happening in other places, and yet, sorry,
it's your daughter.
might be, but I'm kind of looking at how it is articulated in Kashmir. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Yes, right.
If I may, thank you so much for this brilliant presentation. For me personally, I really enjoy anything and everything that debunks syncretism. I have two questions. The first one is related to limits of the past or limits of past traditions, however ambiguous, and to what extent they can be included, Islamically justified, or even their ambiguity can be appreciated in a new tradition. I'm thinking of, say, someone like Sherali Tareen's scholarship on defending Muhammadan modernity. He treats this argument on prophetic intercession as unique to the 19th century crisis of sovereignty. All of this is happening in a particular political movement that makes this question of it's not bidat, it's not syncretism, there's Islamic justification to this practice, etc., that goes into all these debates. So I'm wondering, is 16th century Kashmir or 16th century Persian writing in Kashmir some sort of a political movement that makes this possible, or is it something that is a general view that should apply to all kinds of ambiguous traditions when people are writing about Islam and pre-Islamic past of the region? The second one was on the question of, I believe this is more related to how scholarship around Persianate is developing. Like somehow its universality is being assumed as something that exists, not something that is being created with very political motivations. So if there is a local Kashmirian where they are engaging with local deities, pre-Islamic natural figures, gods, Sufis, saints who can now be considered Sufis, I'm wondering if we are considering this a local tradition, while also assuming a universality of a Persianate ecumen, does this refract into other regions? So if you have a Sufi saint like Hamdan coming into Srinagar, coming into Kashmir, can it be that Lal Ded, when read through Persian, can also be accepted as a wali, say by someone who's reading the same narrative in Iraq at the time? So my question is more broadly about your kind of analysis, methodologically, is that the kind of intervention that we should be making into this assumed universality of the Persian?
Oh, good question. I might actually ask you to re-articulate a couple of things because there was a lot there, and thought-provoking. So I guess that there's a kind of, maybe this is too easy, but I think there's a kind of double move that I'd like to make is to want to say that what was happening in 16th century Kashmir should be read in the context of 16th century Kashmir, in that, like I said, this is a moment of the end of the Kashmiri Sultanate before the Mughals take over. There's a kind of a larger argument that I have that this is a moment in which a kind of early modern bureaucratic state is developed through this conflict. Like, so there's something that is happening like very specifically in this moment that a lot of this discussion is speaking to. At the same time, obviously, like I'm also, well, maybe not obviously, but I'm not an obscurantist either. I'm not interested in, like, if this was only applicable to 16th century Kashmir and has no applicability outside of it, then we shouldn't study it. It's useless. Like, why? And so that's where I started with saying, like, well, these figures, these traditions, these kind of understandings of the world are significant to Kashmiris today, to ideas of like who we are, what our heritage is, how should we make sense of these today? And it's also competed over with by people like Modi, who are saying all this stuff that you're revering as your Kashmiri heritage, that's just a kind of flavor of Indian culture and heritage. And so it's within that contestation, and as we know, the very real political context of Kashmir today, that I think Kashmiris are grappling with these things in the past in order to say, who are we now? What are we doing here today? And I think that's a valid question. And not just a question, I think it should be used if possible in however they want to bring that forward. And so, but that's still local to Kashmir, I guess I'm saying. So that's kind of trans-temporally, but still locally. I do think, and from what I hear from, Prashant and others, that like, oh, there seems to be similar dynamics happening in other places. I'm not aware of many people, up until like when people have been translating Lalud into English verses and circulating amongst that sphere, but like in the 19th century or 18th century, I don't think there are people in Iraq who are reading the Tazkirat al-Arifin and being like, oh, who's this Lalud? I want to revere her as a wali as well. That seems to have not circulated in those places.
But a lot of South Asian Persian things.
Right.
It moves within a South Asian zone.
Yeah. Except. Oh, I was just going to say one little thing, but we also know that there are like coins minted in Afghanistan that have Nandrashi's name on it, which I still haven't been able to track down. So like, it seems like it's circulating in the zone over there too, but I'm not sure exactly how. Anyway, but yeah, there's something interesting there. That's where is it circulating? And I don't think people in Delhi know about Lalud, except for when pundits come on over and settle there or whatever. So there's a way in which it's like, why is that part not circulating? I don't know. Yeah.
It's just Hamza question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So Dean, this is great. It's great to hear about this research. We've been having conversations about this stuff for a long time. I really love how you're juxtaposing the 16th century in some ways in the way that thinking about non-Muslims, thinking about local histories, earlier history, and how different that is from how it would be talked about now, right? And there's something different, what do we gain by thinking about the 16th century? So my question is, can we nuance the history even more by thinking about this 14th versus the 16th century? Because if we're thinking about that time period between 1320 and 1586, there's a massive difference in the state of Islamic institutions in Kashmir between the early 14th century and the late 16th century. And so I wonder, how might there be different ways, or do you see differences in ways of relating to non-Muslim, local, and earlier histories, like differences across that time period, given the kind of big changes that are taking place over the course of that 2.5 years?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good and important question. I would say absolutely things change over the course of that time. And as I said, the kind of political context of there being these kind of two factions, one of which includes non-Muslims in combination with the Rishi Sufis and the Kubrawis and the Suhrawardis, facilitates a certain kind of, I don't know what to say, this is a terrible word, but like an ecumenicalness or like a, like a kind of kindness towards each other's and validation towards each other's traditions, kind of necessitated by a kind of political moment, or at least I would argue that, whereas that wasn't what was going on in the 14th century, and the Rakshis weren't even around then. And so certainly things change over time. But the hard part is that figures like Nundrashi and Lalda don't show up in any writings until the 16th century. So even though they're around in the 14th century, like we don't know how they were dealt with by or understood, or whether there was this kind of incorporation or whatever, because they're just not mentioned. So I wish there was more, and then I could trace that better. We do have.
What about in Kashmiri and Sanskrit?
Exactly.
In
Why look at only at Persian? What about these? What about?
Oh yeah, no, they're not in Sanskrit, they're not in Kashmiri, they're just not there. And so that's, I would love to read silence, but I don't feel like that's methodologically nice. And so like, I don't know, I really don't know. And obviously like in the earlier parts too, in the 14th century, we have a lot more Sanskrit writing. And then so we can then, like, how much can we do from Sanskrit writing about Muslims to then think about relationships between, Muslims and non-Muslims? I don't know. It's just like, are we doing kind of apples and oranges or something, it's much more difficult. But I wholeheartedly agree that the moments of the 16th century and the types of conversations that are happening there is very different than what was happening in the 14th century. But we should talk. Yeah. Please.
Shubha has a question. Then after I'm going to take some questions from from friends in Kashmir.
Yeah.
So I have that.
Okay. Oh, okay.
All right.
Sorry.
I was just thinking about the connections. You are making two different readings. I feel that one is the kind of what makes Kashmiri identity and how it is being developed.
Yeah.
And why in that context, 16th century is more important than other period. That's the first part of the question. Second part of the question is this, that what you were talking about, I read a little bit about Bengali Islam. The same kind of debates are going on. There is also a kind of a very reading of Timrai reads Sir Sultan's Novi Vangsha as syncretic, and Tony Stewart's contested and says it's not syncretic, it is part of the Islamic culture. Today, Rami says there is a kind of translation of Quranic tradition into Quranic tradition, etc. So it seems that, and at the same time, there is obviously in Bengal, there is a question of a relationship between non-Muslim and Muslim in the past traditions. So how far can we talk a bit about the Persian? How far can we talk about it as a South Asian feature? And how can we read into the presentist context? Because after all, in Bangladesh, there is a very powerful nation state, which is both Bengali and Muslim, etc. So,
thank you. Yeah, I mean, these are important questions. So, I mean, what you say first is, why 16th century Kashmir, why this kind of valuing of this over other time periods? I mean, the selfish side is like, because that's what I studied. But another side of it is because of, like I said, that for many Kashmiris now, there's a sense of this was the last time Kashmiris ruled themselves. And so there is this returning to this Kashmiri Sultanate period. But I think the writings about the Sultanate period are most prolific in the 16th century, that there's just a lot of texts about it written in the 16th century about 14th, 15th, and 16th century. And so there's a way in which this moment becomes a source of kind of excavation for Kashmiri identity for many Kashmiris in future centuries. So that's, I guess, if that's a question of like, why 16th century? But as we know, later the Dogra princely state pushes hard to value the, 11th century Kashmir and Abhinavagupta and this era as a golden age of Kashmir and whatnot. And so that has kind of parallels too of saying like, oh, this is the last time and all this sort of stuff. So I think there is this kind of idea, maybe even an idea of like, progress and development that then gets cut off. And so you want to see the peak of that development before something else takes its place. I'm not sure. That's something I'd like to think about more. As for the kind of Persianate feature of all this, I think that, this is something that, I'm in history and, and I work on kind of gender in the body and these sorts of issues. And so kind of Persianate questions I leave to my Persianist friends a bit more, but Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously, these people are citing text after text after text all over the place in Persian, also Arabic, but mostly Persian. And so there's a way in which there seems to be a communication. I would love to, and even Hamza knows this, that there's kind of some nerdy sidetrack of mine that's like, I want to map the kind of imagined universe of these people at these times, like who in what regions of the world were Kashmiris concerned with at this moment, and who in the world was concerned with Kashmiris in this moment. And that maps, I think, quite differently at different time periods, and doesn't fit the maps that we have today of nation states and so on and so forth. And I feel like that could also help us break out of things, and maybe a certain Persianate world would emerge as a map that of concern and connection.
Just follow up because you asked my question.
Oh,
so I'm going to just draw on two things following up from what you say, because you're clearly focused on the Persian and Kashmir. You focus on Islam instead. You see, and I think that's the question, if I may rephrase it.
Sure.
Like, because the logic of translation is front and center. And it becomes less about it being Persianate with its attendant parochialisms. And instead you see an attempt to translate between cultures. And Bengal is a great example because you see exactly what you're saying, which is why it was absolutely fascinating to me to listen to your talk, where there is translation. In fact, Nobi Monk is talking about Muhammad as an holotype, which is it's not prophet, it's an incarnation in the Indic sense. So my question is, how does the presence of a non-Persian Islam, and this will probably also be true of Kerala, which has an older history of Islam, in fact, how would this kind of, in a sense, change your argument, reshape your argument, if at all, and whether the logic of translation is actually something that you think about, and which is, I think, a good handle, which allows one to critique syncretism, but also retain sort of appropriation.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just working slightly. Maybe I want to push back, I guess, the question a little bit. And as far as a discomfort I have with translation is the presumption that these were separate things. So that to say we're translating from a Hindu world into an Islamic world, or an Islamic world into a Hindu world. But these are people that are living and breathing and know about all these traditions. I mean, it's almost like I want us to erase the notion of two-nation theory once we see that people are talking to each other all the time. And so I don't know how much translation requires us to think that these are two things bumping into each other.
Yeah,
and
I had a notion in mind, which actually is not.
Oh, okay, sure.
It's the in-betweenness which actually ends up defining the other two. So that's fine. So it's actually, we're speaking of the same. So coming from a two-nation theory.
No, I wasn't trying to, project that on you. Sorry, but sorry.
We're running out of time. So
sorry.
Soleh, and then Bizot, and then I'm gonna, there's a question from someone online.
Yeah, okay. So thank you very much for this insightful talk. I just had a quick question about the point that you mentioned about the way that different Sufi groups of the time would consider themselves as the true inheritor of the spirituality of Sayyid Ali Hamdani. So I was wondering, how would they justify this? Let's say for Rishis, would they consider themselves as a part of the Tobravi tradition, or would they trace back their spiritual lineage through him? Was he officially a part of their spiritual lineage? This was something that I wanted to know.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And luckily one that I could probably answer pretty quickly. In that they are not claiming to be part of the Kubrawi traditions, but yet write about him extensively, talk, honor him, kind of bring him in and cite his writings and all sorts of things in a way that seems to, from the side, seem to indicate like, oh, we're we're conversant with his world, what he's saying is in line with what we do, all of that sort of stuff to kind of say that like, oh, Ali Hamadani and the way he lived and his greatness is what we're continuing here without having to say like, oh no, we merged lineages and tracing whatever. It's like
Which of his writings do they draw?
a lot. But yeah,
Because he's not all that nice about Hindus. So I'm wondering, given the topic of your talk,
yeah.
he's very hostile. So
Yeah, well, and I will, I guess, as a side note, say they don't actually spend a lot of, well, first, the political writings, like, I think they pretty much don't touch it at all.
Zakhirat.
Yeah, that's like, it's like absent in the writing, which is fascinating because of how much it's upheld today, right? But also that it's like the hagiographical writings, like I said, Badakhshi's writings about him, that they'll cite, or some of his kind of more mystical writings that they'll cite. And there's almost a way in which I think the image, the memory, the kind of legacy of Hamadani is that to them. Whereas this other thing as a jurist, as somebody who is writing advice to kings, they kind of could do without that and kind of is brushed to the side. Interestingly, given especially how much it's brought up, like Muzaffar Alam and others being like, this is such a key text. It's like for Kashmiris, where he wrote it for, they're like, at least for some time. Yeah.
All right, thank you for this wonderful talk. So it is one of the karamats of the talk that like so many questions are raised up. So, I have a few questions. I'm trying to keep them short or just merge them while I'm asking. One is that when we are looking at the definition of the miracles, the karamat, we can see a continuity about like throughout the history of Sufism. That like it's always miracles comes from God and the saints do it on behalf of him, or it functions as a proof of and like aesthetic life. And you mentioned that Dawood Khaki also like defined miracle as such. So what was new in his definition, or what was Kashmiri centered like thing in his definition? How can we relate his definition like in terms of like how can we relate it to Kashmir? And then the other question, I want to just return the discussion to what Pasha mentioned about Khariq al-Ada. And again, so like about Khariq al-Ada, we know that it like relates to the God's Ada. With which we can interpret it as a causality, that God's order is always like the fire burns, then he with capital H decides that it doesn't burn. Again, it can be okay. Look, here is a question. And when we look at the Khariq al-Ada throughout the history, we can see that like there are sometimes like there's a theme related to the social life of like the people there, as such that we can say that there is an adat there, like something that which the saints like do, like the kharagat, the thing, like cheer that adat. Can we like look at the Kashmir at the time and like the karamats of the people there as a like kind of the Khariq al-Ada, which relates to the adat of the time?
Wow, that's interesting. Can you just one quick clarification? So when you're saying the adat of the time, do you mean like social norms, or do you mean like?
We can think about it like in different aspects. What do you think?
Yeah, so something that I'll try to be quick because I also know we have this. So I'll just say what is new and how the adat is functioning. Something that I think myself and Khaki himself is tiptoeing close to, but seems hesitant to step over the line, is that there's a way in which he describes the connection between asceticism and miracles, that he has to keep citing this long tradition of saying it's God doing it on their behalf. They are so close to them that they'll do it for them. But there's almost a compelling that goes on there, that like engaging in hardcore asceticism will lead to God suspending their habits. So it's not like, oh, okay, you do all this asceticism and then God will decide maybe I'll suspend it, maybe not. It's like, no, it's going to lead to that. in which case is the saint compelling God to do it? That is not okay. But at the same time, the ways in which certain practices are prescribed, that it's almost guaranteed that this is what will come on the other side, seems to say, and the reason why asceticism seems to be argued as almost a kind of necessary part of sainthood, is it seems to be arguing, maybe it is, like maybe it's like almost scientifically, you do this experiment, you get this result. We've repeated it so many times, it does that. So it works. Is it that God is just being really generous and doing it every time it's there? Or is kind of God compelled to draw near and suspend things as a result?
This idea of mutual tasfir is not, is there. It's not God and the people are both musafir, are both, I don't know what.
Yeah. But yeah, so I guess I partly say this because I think he is nervous about just like saying that outright. But there's a way in which I think that's going on, because I also think it fits with certain non-Muslim Hindu traditions around tantra and practices and embodying oneself as Shiva and therefore bringing it, like there is a kind of like the method works. I don't know. There's and that thing is, yeah. Anyway, you know what I'm saying.
So Shakir Hassan has a question. Maybe you could just read it out. And then...
Oh, sorry. I thought you had two parts there. Sounds good. Okay.
Like the second question about the that's.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
All right. So yeah.
About.
So I was trying to talk about it with the other, but yeah, but as far as kind of changing society or something, we could talk about that more.
Good.
Yeah,
good.
yeah, that's good. Yeah. Okay. Yes. So Shakir Hassan. Hello, thank you for your lecture. I have a question. I am working on the Rishi Lama text. Daud Khaki was distancing from the Nurbakshiya Shia, calling them heretical and anti-Sharia, while he was very moderate and validating the miracle performing behavior of the Rishis. Suhwardiya Sufis produced the largest number of Rishi Namas. Is it because they were competing for more disciples among the Rishis, in a way co-opting or Islamizing these Rishis into their order? Oh, good question. Yes. So, I mean, I don't know if it's like trying to absorb them into the order, but I'll say, I mean, and as you know from reading, that even the Chishtis come in to these writings of the Suhawardis, tracing it back to Multan, and then therefore we can kind of connect to the Chishtis. And so there's a way of like, you know, creating a network. These Suhawardi writers at the time are trying to make themselves a nexus of all the important orders. And I think, again, that this has maybe they were doing that anyway, but it also has a good political value there to say, if we are the ones that can tie together all of these groups, then we can be the ones to be the organization around which the throne can be built. I mean, the throne of Kashmir, the rule of Kashmir. So I think they are, I don't think they're trying to absorb the Rishis in the sense of saying like, you convert to being a Suhawardi, you adopt our, you know, Wird and all this sort of stuff. I don't think they're doing that, but I do think there's a way in which they are trying to say, you're part of our team, you're part of our alliance and network, and not the Nurbakshis. The Nurbakshis are out for the Suhawardis. Yeah.
If there's any more questions, and if not, then maybe we can.
I think Huma might have her hand up.
Huma has a hand up. Oh well, okay. Huma, if you and Samir is on his hand. So Huma and Samir, if you can either type your question or speak. You can speak.
Yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful talk, Dean. It reminded me of my bridge essay from computer science to South Asian studies was an essay on Lal Dad, written in Hamid Algar's class on Sufism. And you know, that incident that you and my argument is actually very much exactly yours, that she was considered a Muslim. She was considered a very pious Muslim before, without necessarily having converted to Islam. But that particular story that you also recounted a little bit of, when she jumps into the oven, when she sees Shah Hamdan, you know, walking into the city, and she suddenly becomes aware of her nudity, and she goes to the grocer can't hide her or doesn't want to hide her, and she goes into the baker's store and she jumps into the oven. And then the next point was that she comes out dressed in green and gold. So, obviously hagiography, miracles, etc., whether they are real or not, that's not the point. The fact that those details are remembered as green and gold, to me, were evidence of the fact that she was accepted as a Muslim. And then later on, way after I'd actually moved to South Asian studies, I did come across a work, I think, by Daniel Hoskins and others as well, about conversion narratives in Central Asia, about narratives of conversion to Islam. And many of them strikingly had a very similar motif of jumping into the fire, jumping into the oven, and coming out as Muslim. And so I thought back about, it resonated with my interpretation and your interpretation, that, and also the fact that her existence, her presence is first mentioned by Muslim historians, right? With a Sufi, with a saintly person of her, of that extent, it would have made sense for her to be mentioned by others as well. But she's first mentioned by Muslim historians. And the last thing is, just familial anecdotes. My father was in Srinagar until he was 24 years old, and my mother is Kashmiri, but born in Amritsar because her family was exiled because of their conversion to Islam. But both of them, and they both knew a lot of stories, a lot of anecdotes about Hazrat Lal Dad. But you know what? Neither of them knew that she was also known as the Shy White. They just thought of her as a very holy Muslim woman. That's why she was.
We're running out of time. Seriously,
Okay, thank you. That was it.
Thank you for your comments. Samir, just that'll be the last comment.
Please, Samir, and then I'll respond to both of you afterwards. Yeah, please.
It's nice. I mean, how do I make it sort of simple and short? I can't. Let me take a bit of time. So basically, I was thinking this is basically 16th century. And this is a period wherein you have the largest amount of tazkiras. And all of these tazkiras, in a way, are directly linked with Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom, the Suhrawardi. So you have Baba Dawood Khaki, you have Tulmuli, you have Accardi. I mean, the largest amount of tazkiras that we have in Kashmir come from this period. And these Suhrawardis are rather known before early 16th century. They emerged on the landscape in 16th century. And yet Islam is there since, let's say, somewhere around early 14th century or maybe even earlier. So in a way, they are appropriating the rishis who are already there. The rishis are the lived tradition of Islam before the coming of the different silsilas. So in a way, this is a period when you're giving a certain textual legitimacy to practices that are already there in occurrence in the society as such. So was that a part of a political play? Maybe, maybe not. And was it so distinctly between the Nur Bakshiyas and the Suhrawardiyas and the Kubarois? I don't think so. I mean, that might be a bit of a difficult reading. How do you put it there? What is 16th century in Kashmir? But generally, I think it's important that, yes, the Kubriyas are also appropriating the rishis. You don't hear rishis saying that we are a part of the Mir Sayyid Ali Silsila. It is always the Kubriyas who are saying that Nuruddin did a bayat at the hands of Sayyid Ali or Mir Muhammad Hamdani. So, I mean, it is somewhere, again, if you look at the life of Sheikh Hamza Makhdoom, he does, in a way, force certain habits upon Hardi Rashi. The way he asks him to eat meat. I mean, in a way, you're modifying the existing Rashi practices and making them more Sufi oriented. And I think the texts of Dawood Khaki are actually formalizing it for a wider audience. How do you see?
Good. Yeah. So I know we're probably past time. But two things that I'll just say very quickly. One, Huma, thank you. But I will want to point out that the Hamdani oven story is not in the text that I was saying. It was about Hamza Maktoum and saying he's masculine. So that's a different thing. That the Hamadani one, I'm not sure when that one pops up. But I think what's important, or I would argue that while Luldeb could be seen that it wouldn't be considered bidat to have reverence for her, I think she's intentionally liminal in the text. Again, because she's not, she's out of the contention for masculine competition is there. I think it's also potentially like intentional to not say she's a Muslim or to say that she's a Shaiva. They're like keeping her vague to be this arbiter between things. I think that's important for how Khaki is dealing with her, or Reina is dealing with her. The other thing I will say is that I think you're right about that, that the Rishis don't seem to be wanting to say like, oh yeah, we're Kubrawis too. It seems to be like the Sukhawardis are absorbing them, or maybe the Kubrawis are trying to, or even the Nurbakshis try to start claiming the Rishis. And I haven't worked this all out, but I think this might have to do something with that the Rishis are on the periphery. They're out in the wilderness. They're across Kashmir. A lot of these orders are centered in the cities, are centered in, populous areas or whatever. So, and kind of following us from Moeen's idea that like your spiritual resources and those saints that can control those resources that are out there, the Rishis are out there and kind of settling the landscape. And so everyone wants to be able to have access to the Rishis who control all those resources in some ways. So yeah, I think everybody wants the Rishis, and a lot of other ones, like as much as they might do lip service or even participate in bodily asceticism themselves, especially sultans, they want to pay the Rishis to do it for them. You don't want to have to do asceticism, but you want to patronize asceticism, which then creates sainthood and gets God's favor and all those sorts of things. So there's a way in which the Rishis do carry a certain increased value over other, saints maybe at the time. Okay.
Well, okay. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, everyone who's online. And I hope you enjoyed that. Yeah, you want those?
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.